Philosophers talk to our times. We citizens of dystopia. The refractive dialectic. One of the things I hope you've noticed about dystopia... before I start, I might do one other on this series, but I'm getting tired of it. So we're going to go on to one of my favourite series, The Brief History of Middle, or The Natural History of Middle, sorry, which will certainly start by Monday. But one of the facets of a dystopia is that it is full of very artificial dialectics. And though being artificial, or perhaps just being genuine dialectics, they're not reconcilable. They're almost just oppositions, but they're oppositions that are kind of linked. And you always get the feeling that you can only move beyond the dystopia if somehow you find a way out of this dialectic trap. I've been doing them in terms of left and right just because one of the queer things about the kind of society that we live in is that although we have reached in some ways a full postmodern condition, and I'll come back to that, where notions of left and right really don't make much sense, arguably at all. Certainly if you looked at the modern successors to the old socialist parties, they all went neoliberal a long time ago. And the genuine left is now firmly called popularist and seen as rather akin to the right. And that world in which one could actually address the world that is in terms of politics, and actually talk about how neoliberalism has destroyed economies on a properly nuanced level. Well, it exists. It exists in academia. Of course it does. And exists on the margins of politics. But there are a few politicians who are capable of explaining what's happening, and none who try. I say that, perhaps one or two try a bit, but it isn't the normal stuff of politics, because it's not what a dystopia does. A dystopia wants to create wants to create either dialectics that are not dialectical because there's no opposition, or totally unreconcilable dialectics that are not kind of substantial, although I don't know what substantial means in that context. They're not essential. They are the kind of dialectics that you arrange from different positions of different theories of difference and identity, and moving them in slightly different ways, or different ways, as I said before, to emote. So that we emote our politics. And to go back to the irony, of course, is just when the categories of left and right have become essentially very useless, that's the moment politics divides very much on left-wing and right-wing issues, when it becomes terribly divisive, and any idea of reconciliation is lost. And that's one of the very queer features of dystopia, that it kind of wants division on the emotional level, and therefore total and complete. And yet, because of the way emotion works, it kind of presents it as a dialectic. We could call them all spectrums if you like, but they're the kind of spectrum that only if you can answer this problem, only if you can find one way or t'other to reconcile both bits of the dialectic, are you ever going to be able to break the dystopia. Because the dystopia is the opposition, and the sequence of oppositions. And behind this is, of course, the greatest opposition of them all. The one that actually really can never be reconciled and is highly problematic. And that is the opposition between the situation we find ourselves in, when finally the slow train that was the postmodern condition has fully arrived. Oh, when I was a young man, about 40 years ago, yes, 40 years? I think it's 50 years since the postmodern condition was written. I think it was written in 1976 or something like that. Might have been a bit later, but it's that kind of time. When you have philosophers like Lyotard investigating how modernity would fundamentally turn the actual world into a lie. It would eat out any concept of integral truth within the world in which we lived and replaced it with spectacle, with that Guy Debord's society of the spectacle writ large, and where everything is always merely already just a sign or a symbol, just a part of a bigger picture. And therefore there is no essential truth in truth. Now, when I was 20 and read that, I kind of understood it, and I loathed the media too. But being young and naive, I rather hoped for truth in politics, and that there was far more essential in the world than it allowed for. And it took a good few years before I moved on from that position. And now, well, now we've all moved on from that position. The very way we think about AI undermines our own take on truth, our own ability to understand who and what we are, because you can just plug in your plastic pal, who's fun to be with, and bingo, you can change what your mind can do. You can change who and what you can be, only on the level of the virtual, only on the level of the computer. You can rewrite history, rewrite news stories, play with the truth, create false images or accuse other people of creating false images. So the very notion of who you are, what your skill set is, disappears. And once that disappears, any notion of truth that is related to your existence starts to crater. Now, perhaps that wouldn't matter, but the actual world of physics, of course, doesn't work like that. I mean, that's one of the, I suppose, the hilarious things about the Trumpian experiment. The Trumpian experiment is an experiment in cloud compelling. Let's elect somebody who's so daft that they'll just cloud compel and have an idea and think that they can do it and ignore all the world of physics. Trump is the perfect post-truth president. The perfect postmodern president. But of course, somewhere else, there is a world of truth. I mean, that's one of the things I love about common notions and Spinoza and the rationalists I deal with, is that although they can cope with relativity and the idea that everything actually is relative, somewhere elsewhere, there is something that if you ignore it, or just say that it isn't there, will get you in the end. Entropy is real. And because entropy is real, because the laws of thermodynamics kind of bind our version of matter, we're all caught up in some horrible drama that even as we sit there making films of our own arses and are caught in the postmodern condition where all truth is relative, the climate is shrugging its shoulders and not caring two farts what we think, as it plunges us into climate chaos. And here, I think one of the problems we have is that, was it 100 years ago? I think it was, that the climate change was labelled the wrong thing. It was called global warming, which it should never have been called. It should have actually been called increased entropy within the overall climate, or for the quick resume is climate chaos, where you can no longer predict what the climate will do day in, day out. And so even as we give up on truth and give up on anything sensible, the climate slips from our control. As an aside, I always find it very funny that those people who want to say it was ever thus with the climate always cite 1976 as the warmest summer ever, which it wasn't. It just wasn't. It didn't have the warmest day, not by a long chalk. And always say, well, we were good with heat then, so why not now? Maybe. But that's not what the problem ever was. The problem is not that we think it's warming and so we now panic. The problem is the sheer speed of change. That's what climate chaos in the end means. Always, the example should not be 1976. If you want the example of when the climate did it before, it would be 1975, where it snowed in June and then was very hot the day before and about 3 days afterwards. That's actually the example. And that's the kind of world we're entering into. Look at this summer in France, where we've gone from 17 degrees to 34 degrees in a day. Plants can't cope with that. Bodies can't cope with that. And the reason why we all feel it is that it's not like there's an interim. And I live in the deep south, in the Pyrenees. And the Pyrenees create their own buffer on the climate, so it doesn't do what the rest of France does. It's more buffered. Yes, when it goes colder, it can go a bit colder. But fundamentally, it has its own insulation. And without that insulation, the kind of civilization that we've created certainly cannot cope with climate chaos. All the more so as it is amusing itself with its own post-truth, post-modern condition, and totally blinding itself. I have said before that I actually think probably willfully blinding itself from its own effects. I mean, if you had to list what would be the most suicidal thing that you could do at this moment, it would be to have rival companies create data centers, just to use up all the energy, to pump out entropy into the wider environment, so that we can, even as we merge our identity with our plastic pals, make sure that the overall climate chaos is that bit worse. Make sure that the infrastructure is that bit more vulnerable. In a sense, it's no wonder at that point governments want to seize control of the means of representation. Of course they do. Because once the means of representation has slipped beyond any control, once it's all become caught up with the Peter Thiels of this world and with their fairly dark conspiracy theories, but also with humans who are remodelling themselves, albeit on the virtual world, all government actually becomes genuinely impossible. And so you then have another struggle that enters in where the governments are trying to seize control of the postmodern condition, perhaps because they've got a blind eye on the climate chaos that's about to come. And you enter into a perfect stew. There is no reconciliation here. There is no reconciliation because the hard physics of entropy won't budge. It doesn't change. It won't conform to what we want it to be. We are the ones that have to conform or die. And that stark choice, I think, is the choice that haunts all dystopias. They're all fundamentally nihilistic. That's why Trump is the perfect president of a dystopia. Not because he's clever, not because he can wield power, not because he's Big Brother, not because he's anything than a vacant fart. But that vacant fart is the very fact that makes it so palpable what is happening, that the lie becomes obvious and apparent, that postmodern condition, that idea that you can defy physics, is just nonsense. It's not going to work like that. And yet we live in a society that is denying truth in order to hide itself from the hideous truth that it is unleashed. And our problem is, unless we can get back to something like well, you want my honest opinion, a Marxian perspective, where at least you can understand the dialectic, you think of it in terms of reconciliation, and you have a set of tools that will allow you to somehow rejoin history and make time move again. Unless you can be like Hamlet and reconnect time, then you're really very, very stuck. And you're stuck in that postmodern world, but with the added effect that entropy is catching up with us. And that's where we are. If I had to put the dark picture on dystopia, it is that. It is that dilemma, that being caught up with the trap of entropy, even as we don't really believe in truth at all. And so the hardest truth in physics gets us. I wish this series could have a better conclusion, but I don't have one. I don't have one. For the reason that the most unwilling conspiracy theorist in the world, I hate conspiracy theories, now live in probably the most conspiracy theory area of France, just because it's full of people who are thinking about ways to survive a coming chaos. Because I think it's the best place to learn. I don't know what you want to do, but I suggest you start to do it very, very soon.